Tonight on KQED Newsroom, a Supreme Court nomination in jeopardy as Brett Kavanaugh faces sexual assault accusations. We'll talk with the Bay Area lawmaker who was the first member of Congress to hear about the assault allegations from Blasey Ford. Also, trouble in the classroom. New research reveals an alarming achievement gap that starts at an extremely young age. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with the High Court and politics. President Donald Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, is being accused of sexual and physical assault. Bay Area professor Blasey Ford says Kavanaugh assaulted her at a high school party more than 30 years ago. In July, Ford described details of the alleged attack to her local representative, Palo Alto Congresswoman Anna Eshoo. Ford and Kavanaugh have been asked to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And joining me now via Skype from her office in Palo Alto is Congresswoman Anna Eshoo. Congresswoman, thank you for being here.
Well, it's good to be with you, Thuy. Thank you.
Can you take us back to that day in July when you met with Blasey Ford in your office? How did she seem as she told you her story?
I was struck by the following. She is an intelligent woman. She's highly educated. Very devoted to her family, concerned about her family. I think it was wrenching for her to share her story, difficult to tell. It had a layer of emotion over it, which is not untypical of sexual abuse victims. Victims of sexual abuse are terrified. Mm-hmm. They're terrified that their name will get out, what people will say, that they will be blamed. There's a whole raft of issues attached to that. And I also shared with her that I was not here to tell her what I thought she should do, but rather if there was something that she wished me to do on her behalf, that I was prepared to do that.
Did you believe her?
At the end of our meeting, I said to Dr. Ford, I want you to know that I believe you. I did then, I do now.
President Trump posted tweets this morning suggesting that he has doubts about Ford's story. What is your reaction to that?
Well, he's so misguided and uninformed. All he had to do was to check with his own Department of Justice to understand that there are, and these are facts, that 2 out of 3 sexual abuse cases are not reported. And there are many good reasons for that. Again, the victims are frightened. In many cases, when they're young, they don't want their families to know. They feel ashamed. They think that they are going to be blamed. So I don't think the president is an authority on this issue. Let's leave it at that.
Ms. Ford now says she will testify. Mr. Kavanaugh has already agreed to testify. There are no other witnesses summoned. What is your reaction to how the process is unfolding?
It's been a rocky road. And it's been a rocky road because I think that overall, that the committee has been more inclined in the following way, and that is a rush to judgment. Just rush it all, bring it to the floor, vote on it, and get it behind them. This is one of the most consequential decisions that the United States Senate makes, one of the most consequential decisions for the American people. And I think the country and the American people are being left out of this. It's an appointment to a lifetime position on the highest court of our land. So, I think that there should be a full hearing. The FBI should investigate because these are new allegations. The administration has said that that Judge Kavanaugh has been vetted several times, and he has, and that's appropriate. But Dr. Ford's story was not part of that vetting. I also believe that Mark Judge should be subpoenaed. He was the 3rd alleged party to be in the room. All right. And for him to be left out is a glaring, I think, purposeful oversight.
We live in a different era now than from the 1991 Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings. Back then, it was a panel of all white men questioning Ms. Hill. Now the Senate Judiciary Committee has 4 women, 4 people of color. We also have the Me Too movement. Do you think that we've come far enough? And will that make a difference this time around in terms of what we're seeing with the Ford-Kavanaugh situation?
Well, I think it's important to note the changes, which are so welcome. They are on the Democratic side. The women. Several of the senators on the Republican side were there for the Anita Hill hearings, and they are still there. So it's an all-white male, older cast that's in the majority. And of course, they have the power to subpoena. They have the power of whatever the process is that's determined. So one side has changed, and I would say the other side hasn't. I think where the most change has taken place is across the country with the American people, because there is a broad and deeper knowledge and appreciation for what the sexual abuse is in our country, that it needs to be addressed, that it needs to be taken seriously, and that those that come forward need to be respected.
You know, with the midterm elections just 7 weeks away, we're now hearing that Facebook is setting up a so-called war room. This is to root out false news and fake accounts as we head into the midterm elections. How much confidence do you have in Facebook's efforts here to try to curb foreign influence in our elections?
Well, I think it's important that they are doing what they're doing relative to their platform. And I appreciate that, and I think it's important. But it doesn't resolve the overall issue that we have in our country relative to the security of our voting systems. We know that the Russians interfered in 2016, our national elections and votes that are cast. If those are tampered with, then our democracy has been attacked. And so I would fault the majority in Congress that despite our pleas, despite the legislation that has been written, the Congress has not really lifted a finger to assure the American people that they are secure.
And here in California, the state legislature has passed a net neutrality bill that's now waiting for Governor Brown's signature. This goes against recent moves by the Trump administration. It basically would stop internet service providers from blocking or slowing certain websites unless they pay more. Where do you stand on that bill?
Well, my colleagues, I think out of affection, dubbed me the mother of net neutrality in the House. So I've been on this issue for a long, long time and have written with all of my colleagues from the Northern California Congressional delegation urging Governor Brown to sign that bill.
All right. Palo Alto Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, we thank you for your time.
Thank you.
For more on the confrontation between Kavanaugh and Ford and a look at California politics, I'm joined now by Aimee Allison, president of Democracy in Color, Republican political strategist Sean Walsh of Walsh Consulting, and Carla Marinucci, senior writer at Politico. Good to have all of you back.
Thank you.
We will talk about the Kavanaugh, Blasey Ford showdown in just a moment. But first, Sean, the New York Times is reporting today that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein apparently wanted to secretly tape meetings with President Trump and also tried to invoke the 25th Amendment to have him removed from office. What do you make of this? Rosenstein is denying all of it. Any credibility to these claims?
I think R. Rod's having a bad night at TGI Friday happy hour. I think he got a professional hit done on him by people within his own agency, both at the Department of Justice and at the FBI, based on the fact that they don't think he's standing up enough to President Trump on releasing their material on Russia and a whole host of other issues.
I think it's ironic that the president has disparaged the New York Times as a failing paper for so long, and he's tweeting out this story as his son is, and basically standing up for the story. As you said, Rosenstein has absolutely denied it. And I think, Sean, you have a point. It does seem suspicious. It is anonymous sources.
And what does it do to the credibility of all of those institutions. It's difficult to know what to believe now.
Yeah.
You hit the nail on the head. I mean, this really is damaging to our federal government, particularly our top law enforcement entity.
All right, well, speaking of institutions, let's move on to the Supreme Court, because that has been the major story all week long. Christine Blasey Ford is now saying she will testify. We don't know exactly when yet. Carla, there was some resistance to it in the beginning, and there is still a little bit of resistance now as to the timing and the conditions. How is all of this playing out?
I mean, look, Senator Feinstein has taken the criticism from both sides of the aisle, from President Trump and from Kevin De Leon, her U.S. Senate challenger. And at the same time, Christine Blasey Ford is in the center of this firestorm. Her defenders say she wants to testify. She just wants to have some conditions met by the Senate. It looks like there may be some accommodation there, but not all the way. The fact is, I mean, what we need to look at now is how is this going to affect the Kavanaugh confirmation, the timing, which is critical. We're looking at the first Monday in October when the Supreme Court sits. And then how does it affect the turnout in the election and energy on both sides of the aisle? There is so much at stake here from both sides.
There is, and I was reading, speaking of the New York Times, the op-ed that Anita Hill, you know, I grew up watching Anita Hill testify.
I think we all did.
Those years ago. Do you know, she pointed out that the structures that the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Senate has to deal with claims of sexual harassment haven't changed in 30 years. Feinstein knew that. She's been in office all those years.
Well, she wrote the Year of the Woman,
right.
you know, which
all the way to office.
All the way to office right after the Anita Hill hearings.
So she does bear some responsibility about the rules that are still in place that make it difficult for people, you know, to have some level of transparency. There should be a way for and a process to deal with and discuss and investigate these claims. And there isn't. And so those should be changed as a longer term thing. But I think Senator Feinstein and I think her constituents here in California expect her to do everything she can as a Democrat to at least take the cover off of what is going on with Kavanaugh in light of the fact that a lot of the papers and his writings haven't been released to the public or have been leaked in the public. And I think she fell short on that.
And you know, it's a curious situation when you have her Senate challenger, Kevin De Leon, agreeing with President Trump on something, which is they both feel like Feinstein mishandled this situation for different reasons. But
Kevin De Leon still won't win his Senate district against Dianne Feinstein.
He's trying, though. You can't blame him for trying.
So in this instance, I mean, it is murky. Senator Feinstein had this for 6 weeks. It could have been looked at and vetted. It could have been part of the investigatory process going forward. There's a lot of Republicans who feel that Ruth Bader Ginsburg gets put forward 97-3. Democrats get forward. Justice Ginsburg comes up, smokes some marijuana, he gets smoked and knocked out. Whether you think Harriet Miers was qualified or not, she gets knocked out. Every Republican that comes up goes through this abuse, what Republicans feel is abuse by Democrats on a partisan basis. I was in the Bush White House for the Clarence Thomas hearings on the other side. I was the junior staffer that was staffing this hearings, and people felt then that this came up at the last minute, was a last minute attack to try and thwart this. So from a Republican perspective, they think that these are rank political bias issues. Now, this is a very serious charge, and it needs to be looked at in a very credible way. And if there's evidence that comes forward or she's credible, then action should be taken. But he has a right to be heard.
But rushing to hearings and rushing to a vote without involving FBI and other kinds of investigation doesn't make sense. We have to remember just 1 year ago from a Democratic Party, and I don't speak for all Democrats, but I will say that President Obama had a Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland, for a really long time. And the Republicans delayed and delayed until they got to make their pick. And so, you know, from my perspective, the Republicans aren't playing fair on this, and it's not a transparent process.
Yeah, and just quickly, I mean, Senator Feinstein in her defense says, look, the confidentiality of a constituent here was the overriding concern, and that she couldn't ask for an investigation or turn it over to anyone else without betraying that confidentiality.
But then a week before they're supposed to have the hearings, that this confidentiality then goes off the table.
The story had been leaked, remember?
And how did it get leaked?
And this is the question, but I also think John Yoo, who's a Bush member of the Bush,
and a close personal
a close person, has said there's no reason why they can't do an FBI investigation. That should be the bottom line.
Well, I would say she should be heard. He should be heard. If evidence or testimony comes up that then goes to the next step, you can stop, look at exactly what she said. She has not talked to the staff about this matter when they've wanted to interview her in closed-door session, or she has not talked to the senators in closed-door session. Let her be heard. If this is credible and other witnesses come forward, the Senate's not going to vote immediately.
Look, the burden of responsibility of proof of innocence is on Kavanaugh.
It's not.
It isn't. It isn't on Christine Ford. This is the same reason that there was a Me Too movement in the first place. Women were not believed, and so we should be in 2018 operating from a different point of view. Trump's recent tweet saying, "Hey, if it was that bad, you should have gone to the FBI." Shows the attitude of hasn't changed. It's ridiculous to say that about a 15-year-old girl in a traumatic circumstance.
All right, we do have to move on. Clearly, a lot more to discuss on this, and I'm sure this will carry into next week. We may have you all back to talk about it next week. But in the meantime, let's move on to the congressional races, the midterms, because of course, hanging over all of this, the Kavanaugh confirmation hearing, are the midterm elections. Republicans were hoping to, get it wrapped up as soon as possible before the elections. We have Democrats now trying to flip 23 congressional House seats. 7 of those are in California, key battleground state here. Aimee, what is happening in those races? They're becoming pretty tight.
Very tight. Let's look at Congressional District 39, Royce's that seat. Redistricting redistricting has made the population shift. It's 68% people of color, 30% Asian Pacific Islander. And the reason I point that out is because across the country and in California's primaries, there have been these late surges, and pollsters and establishment people have been surprised by those who made it through primaries without establishment support. In fact, 1 of 3 of the nominees that are going to be on the November ballot are women of color, and these are people who came through without Democratic Party blessing. Yeah. But what's happening in Orange County is that it's a sort of a similar kind of situation where we have a heavily people of color population, and so it's all going to be about turnout. And pollsters right now are saying, well, it's slightly a Republican advantage, but they're not looking at the incredible growth of women and women of color in that district alone. I think that's going to be the X factor, and I think they're not counting it right now.
This was the heart of the Reagan Revolution. Remember, I was with Gavin Newsom traveling on his bus this week in Orange County, and to see the turnout of women at these events, it was pretty impressive. Many of them said the first time they had ever been involved politically was at the Women's March. Many were women of color, as you said. So it's going to be interesting to see, did they actually come out and vote? But you're seeing signs that, yes, the energy is there down there, and we may be in for a very big shift in Orange County.
Sean, with those key tight Republican races, do you think there's enough momentum on the Democratic side for a blue wave?
I think the actual Kavanaugh process now has had a bit of a negative impact on those races. I think that Republicans are getting more solidified and thinking there's raw politics being played in here, and it may raise the number of Republicans that turn out. I think you're absolutely right. Young Kim is a woman of color, an Asian woman, and I think she's going to do very well in that district. I think all said and done across the entire country, the race probably comes down to whether African-American women come out in large numbers.
All right, we'll rest it there. Sean Walsh, political consultant with Wilson Walsh, Aimee Allison with Democracy in Color, and Carla Marinucci with Politico. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Turning now to education, a new research project reveals big achievement gaps by race, income, and ethnicity among California's 6 million school children. Among the findings, the achievement gap starts as early as kindergarten. And while student test scores are improving, 4th and 8th grade students still perform below the national average in reading and math. Equity is also a problem, with Black and Latino students having worse academic outcomes than their white and Asian peers. Joining me now to discuss the findings are Heather Huff, Executive Director of Policy Analysis for California Education and one of the researchers who contributed to the report called Getting Down to Facts 2. And also San Francisco Chronicle education reporter Jill Tucker. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So, Heather, one of the most troubling findings in your study was that the achievement gap begins even before kids enter kindergarten. How is that so?
Well, it's a great question. In this set of studies, we wanted to find out where the achievement gap was happening and who it was affecting most. So we've known for a long time that we have gaps in 4th and 8th grade, and that we have those by race, income, lines by language status. But what this paper and this set of studies contributed is that we can see those gaps before students even set foot in school.
What contributes to that?
Well, to a large degree, it's a fragmented early childhood system, a fragmented and underfunded system that some say isn't a system at all. Children have super varied access to early childhood learning opportunities, and so when they start, they're on different footing based on their characteristics coming into school.
In terms of the quality of child care they get or preschool education, what are some of the things that are part of this patchwork quilt that you pointed out?
Well, I think any parent who has a child this age knows that right now in our state, child care is very expensive. And also the quality of child care is not highly regulated across the state. So a lot of kids, their parents can't afford to put them into child care at all. And of the kids that are in early childhood, early childhood care or training or education, there's a lot of variation in terms of what they get from an educational perspective. And there's also a lot of variation in terms of the teachers that are in those positions serving them. It's not a high wage position, and there's not a lot of regulation around training.
You know, and what I think was so interesting about that aspect of this study, which encompassed so much, but the one thing that I thought was really interesting about that information about children coming into kindergarten behind was that once they got into kindergarten, California schools and the children kept pace with other states across the country, which means if they could actually start kindergarten on equal footing, our schools are keeping pace in terms of teaching them once they get there. So it gives sort of this really narrowed zone of where to focus some of our efforts. If we could get them into kindergarten at the same level as their peers across the country, they're going to keep up.
So then what needs to happen to close that gap prior to kindergarten? Will funding alone be the difference?
Well, I think, as Heather said, there's a variety of issues with that. It's access, it's quality, and so, you know, many in the state have been calling for universal preschool for many, many years, which would allow more controls over that system. So far, we haven't been able to. We've made baby steps in that. We have transitional kindergarten now. We certainly have some preschool programs for low-income families, but it is a bit of a patchwork right now. It's not universal for all families and all children to sort of get us to that start line at the same place.
And funding alone is never enough. We've shown across all of the 36 studies that we do need more money in our system, but we know from decades of education research that if you put money into the system, other things need to be in place to make sure that money's well spent. And it's the same with this early childhood situation. We need to make sure that we have a good data system so that we can understand the services that our youngest children are receiving and how that's affecting their outcomes. We also need to train those early childhood teachers very well so that all kids are getting that high quality instruction, and then make sure that everyone gets a place in a classroom.
There is this achievement gap, but once they get into the California's public school system, we are able to help them close that gap. But is it enough for them to completely catch up? That is, to be on par with students in other states, or do they start so far behind that they never really quite catch up?
No, they are not able to catch up in most situations. So because of that gap and how big it is on day one, our schools are doing better than schools in other states actually at closing it, but they're not able to accelerate it to completely close the gap. And so what we see in California is that our most affluent students are achieving compared to the highest levels in other states. But it's our low income, our Black Latino students, our English language learners that aren't getting served in the way that we'd like.
And Heather, your research team says that California used to be a leader in early school education, but now has fallen behind other states. How did this happen?
That's a great question. And one of the things this is why we've kind of tried to step back and think about the entire system and why we looked at pre-K through 12 education, because all of these pieces are related. And what we've seen is that there's been a huge emphasis on K-12 education in the past, decades, and that we have made some really vast improvements in this area around funding, around support, changes to the accountability system. And so not only do we still need improvements in K-12, but this early childhood piece just hasn't been attended to in the same way that others have.
And Jill, funding alone can't fix everything, but you would think that some of these problems would have been mitigated because California has put in place finance reforms aimed at improving public education. The state has been allocating more money for schools since 2005. There's now a local control funding formula that lets local districts determine how to spend state money that best serves their students. Yeah. So why haven't we seen more improvement?
Well, we've seen some and in some places, but we need to look at how to focus those dollars better. But the report also states that California is last when it comes to counselors and things like that. And they put a dollar figure on that, $100 per kid. We could have, better mental health care and health care for all students in the state. But ultimately, the report also says that to adequately fund schools, compared to other states, we need another $22 billion, which is about a third more. So it's not that money solves all the equations, but money is part of the equation. And according to the study, we're about a third behind of where we should be.
Heather, I also wanted to ask you about English learners. There are about 1 million of them in California's public education system. 40% of California students who enter the school system are English learners. How are they faring compared to other groups?
So some of the problems that I discussed earlier, they're most felt by this group. So their achievement at kindergarten is lower. They aren't able to catch up to their peers. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There are a few that are identified in these 36 studies that we conducted are around the quality of services that are provided to these students and around teachers, the teachers that those students have. We didn't talk yet about teacher shortages, which is something that's identified as a looming issue here for our state. And it's not everywhere, but we do have teacher shortages in urban areas, in rural areas, and specifically for these students in high needs groups. And English learners are particularly hit by that issue.
All right, well, thank you for bringing us up to speed on all this. Heather Huff with Policy Analysis for California Education, and also Jill Tucker with the San Francisco Chronicle. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And that will do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.